The world is trying to figure out the impact after the death of Iran's president and foreign minister in this weekend's chopper crash. CBS 13's Erica Brown is at the White House.
Mourners filled the streets in Iran Monday after learning their president, Ibrahim Raisi, and foreign minister were found dead in the wreckage of a helicopter crash. This man said, "This truly great calamity has descended upon us like a burning thunderbolt." In other parts of the world, Iranian exiles pointed to Raisi's history of brutally suppressing protesters.
Resistance units inside of Iran, they are very, very happy today. They celebrate also inside of Iran because he killed all of our people.
Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei quickly named Vice President Mohammad Mokber the interim president, and he held his first cabinet meeting. Iran has been at the center of crises around the world, and that's unlikely to change with Raisi's death.
We will continue to confront the Iranian regime's support for terrorism, its proliferation of dangerous weapons, and its advancement of its nuclear program in ways that have no credible civilian purpose.
At least one Iranian official blamed the U.S. for the crash, saying sanctions prevent Iran from buying replacement parts for their fleet of American-made helicopters.
The United States had no part to play in that crash, and that's a fact, plain and simple.
The U.S. issued condolences for Raisi's death, even as the administration blames him for trampling on human rights.
Joining us now in studio is Professor Sahar Razavi. She's the Director of Iranian and Middle Eastern Studies at Sac State. Thank you so much for being here on such short notice. Whenever there is the death of a leader, international, local, it makes headlines, and the first reaction is, what does this mean for the broader spectrum of the broader world, specifically the U.S.? So let's start with that. What does the death of the Iranian president mean for Americans?
I'm sure it comes as a huge shock. It's not every day, as we talked about earlier, it's not every day that the head of state or the head of government for a country that is very much in the spotlight, that they die in a helicopter crash. Right now, I think a lot of Americans, those who are following the news, are probably feeling a little uncertain about what's going to happen next. What really changes right now is just the negotiating partner at the table in some ways for the American government, but the person who runs the show in Iran is not the president. The buck stops at the supreme leader, who is Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and that person hasn't changed as of yet and isn't going to change until he passes away. So there is still a continuity in power and in leadership. The presidency right now is obviously the seat being taken by the vice president represents kind of a vulnerability. Any transition from one to the next is going to be a vulnerability in the system in a broader political sense. But right now, it's mostly about how it feels to suddenly have to switch to someone else. It's not so much about a fundamental shift in power.
Correct. So it's the country has a different framework in terms of presidency and the Ayatollah. And we go back to the days of the hostages and Ayatollah Khomeini, who of course made national headlines and international headlines. To be clear, this is considered an accident. There's nothing that would point to anything other than that.
There are some sources in Iran who have suggested that the circumstances are suspicious. The timing is certainly suspicious. It's at the peak of the Israel-Hamas conflagration and everything that has brought, all of the regional players that it has brought to bear. But the weather was very bad. The weather conditions were poor. Helicopters don't crash often, but when they do, the outcomes are usually fatal. It would not be at all a surprise if this were actually legitimately an accident. But of course, there are always going to be, as well, questions about whether it was a suspicious demise.
Such safeguards are taking place whenever the head of a country travels, and he wasn't alone. He also had another top advisor with him, correct?
That's right. So the foreign minister, Hossein Amir Abdullahian, was also in the helicopter, along with 6 others, the governor of the province of East Azerbaijan in Iran, and the head imam in that province as well, and then 4 others, the pilot and the other crew. So you would think, of course, precautions would be taken, but again, he's not the top leader. So it's also not out of the ordinary or out of the question that those 2 main political figures would be there, and then there would be 6 others in the helicopter. That's not something that would raise eyebrows necessarily.
What does this do for the instability in the Middle East? Does it change anything? Does it make it even more unstable?
To the extent that people on the ground in the region will feel unstable, it makes it unstable. Like I said, fundamentally, it doesn't change the power structure in Iran. Fundamentally, it doesn't really change. It's not as if Ebrahim Raisi dying in a helicopter crash or under any other circumstance would provide an opening for some kind of a brand new face to come. The replacement is going to come from the political class. The replacement is also going to come from, it's going to be vetted. Whoever is the next person is going to be thoroughly passed through with all the other agencies and figures in Iran. It's not going to be someone who's going to rock the boat, as Raisi wasn't someone who would rock the boat.
How big of a hand does the Ayatollah have in giving the thumbs up to the next president?
Extremely strong. Extremely strong. In Iran, there are various bodies, various institutions that go through kind of they have elections, but elections are not competitive. They are competitive, but they're not sort of free and fair elections, as you might imagine. Anybody could go sign up. Any citizen of Iran could go and throw their name in the hat and say, I want to run for president. But they have to be vetted, and hundreds are disqualified. In fact, in the last round, which Raisi won, some very surprising figures, surprising for a lot of Iranians, were disqualified because they weren't considered to be faithful enough to Islamic principles, for example. So the supreme leader is going to be the #1 kind of influence, although it's not actually his office that vets the candidates. Certainly the office that does vet them is doing so with strong fidelity to what they believe the Ayatollah wants.
I see. Just to reset, we're speaking with Professor Sahar Razavi about the death of the Iranian president who died in that tragic helicopter crash. Just to put things in perspective, a lot of Iranian Americans live in our area around the country. I think the 21,000 Iranian expats live in Sacramento alone. What are they thinking right now, if you could broadly speak for them?
So I hesitate to speak for everyone, but as a whole, I can say Iranian Americans are typically mostly in opposition to the regime, just by virtue of being expats or being diaspora. Mostly the people who have left Iran and have not returned are those who, for their own reasons, don't want to be in Iran, right? So generally, I would say, given Raisi's history, given his past and his prominence in the Iranian system, most Iranian expats right now are most likely either relieved, or some of them have posted on social media, for example, being thrilled. Raisi was one of the figures responsible for the death, the execution of thousands of political prisoners in 1988. He was the head of the judiciary prior to being the president of Iran. He was known as the hanging judge. He oversaw the brutal crackdown of the Woman Life Freedom Movement in 2002. Excuse me, in 2003. So he was not a popular figure among people who are opposed to the regime. And so if you think statistically, demographically, most Iranian expats, Iranians living in the diaspora in the United States, are not aligned with regime politics. Most Iranians here in Sacramento, at least those that I've spoken with, are, again, either relieved or outright happy.
Do you think when the doors are closed and they're around the dinner table that they are maybe skeptical about how this happened?
I'd be surprised if there were not dozens of conversations happening right now about all the various ways this could have happened, differing from the official narrative. Iranians are generally pretty skeptical of government narratives. We have a very long history of being misled by our government, and so Iranians are not known for trusting the official story that comes out of the government.
We talked off camera before we came out here to talk about Israel-Hamas and whether this moves the needle in any way, shape, or form. Iranian government has been strong supporters of Hamas, as you mentioned. Does this play in at all with what happened or what could happen moving forward?
I don't think that it's going to shift any foreign policy on the part of Iran. Iran has used, the government of Iran has used the cause of Palestine to bolster its credibility in positioning itself as an anti-Western or anti-imperial force in the region. It has also been vying for power for decades in an attempt to become the regional hegemon. This doesn't really change any of the strategic implications for its alignment with Hamas and with Palestine as a whole. I think right now, what that does for Americans and Iranian Americans watching from abroad is it can kind of feel a little complicated. As I said, statistically, Iranians here, Iranian Americans, are more likely to be opposed to the regime. At the same time, we have a tendency to kind of think in terms of good guys and bad guys. And so in terms of what it means for Palestine and what it means for how we want to align ourselves, it can be maybe beneficial to try to break out of the good guy and bad guy mold to see who is actually in power, who is suffering, and where the kind of the next moves are going to be.
In the U.S., whenever there is a change of leadership at the top, people talk about how life is going to change for some people. It sounds like even with a new president coming in, things aren't going to change much.
The best case scenario is that someone that is like the former president Hassan Rouhani, someone who's considered a quote-unquote reformist, would be the president. And I say best case scenario in terms of people's daily lives in Iran. When reformist presidents are in power in Iran, for example, just one out of a few examples I could give, enforcement of the hijab or the covering becomes a little bit more lax, for example. Whereas when social conservatives like Raisi, like Ahmadinejad, when they are in power, enforcement becomes much more stringent. So if a reformist were to come, perhaps that enforcement would be loosened a little bit, and maybe people would feel a little bit less pressure in a daily sense. But the economic crisis that Iran is suffering is really not going to change. The overall structure of the Iranian political system is definitely not going to change with a new president coming in. So I don't think that it's going to make a huge difference for people whether Raisi's presidency is ended or another is going to begin. No one is going to burst onto the scene and radically transform the system under the current.
It's so steeped in tradition and centuries old. What's been happening there? If this had been the death of the Ayatollah, we'd be talking about a much different story, right?
It'd be a huge difference, absolutely. So the supreme leader, there are a couple of people. In fact, I'm glad that you asked this because Raisi was one of the two not officially but unofficially top contenders for the role of supreme leader after Khamenei's death. Raisi and Khamenei's son Mojtaba Khamenei are widely believed to be the two people who would be most likely to succeed Khamenei as supreme leader after his death. He's 89 years old. It's not going to be decades from now, most likely. So the likely scenario now is that his son will come into power in that role, and his son is likely to continue the same policies and the same general program as Khamenei himself. Again, there are several different power-sharing institutions that solidify the kind of power structure in Iran, and those ensure its stability to withstand threats from competitors, for better or worse. I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on where you stand.
What would you like to see the U.S. response be to this, other than to give condolences and stuff? I mean, should there be any sort of a reawakening of movement and dialogue or diplomacy or anything?
It's a possibility. In terms of what I would like to see, it's hard to answer that question without also answering the question of what other pieces on the board would have to move, right? So it's an election year for the United States. The two top contenders in the U.S. are both unlikely to seek rapprochement with Iran, which is interesting because Biden was one of the team members that brought brought into effect the JCPOA, what we call the nuclear deal, right? It was one of the feathers in the cap of the Obama administration. So, but under the current conditions with what's happening in Gaza, it's very, very unlikely that the United States, with its staunch support of Israel, is going to approach Iran, or that Iran is going to approach the U.S. when they are on such opposite sides of this crisis, and say, hey, now that Raisi has died, this is an opportunity for us to reestablish some kind of conversation.
And let's remind our viewers, the Iran nuke deal was shut down by President Trump, correct?
That's right.
Right. So, go ahead.
Mostly. So, President Trump withdrew the United States unilaterally from the JCPOA, but the deal wasn't just between Iran and the United States. The deal was between Iran, the United States, and several European countries. And so at that time, Iran and Europe, they said, well, the U.S. can do what it wants. The deal is between Iran and the rest of us. We're in it still until there's a reason not to be. And so I wouldn't say that Trump shut it down by himself, but certainly it dealt a heavy blow. There were still negotiations until Woman Life Freedom. When that movement came into, when that uprising began, and Iran was cracking down brutally against the protesters, more than 500, including dozens of children, were killed by Iran, and upwards of 20,000 people were detained. The United States at that time basically said the nuclear deal is dead.
The question was having to do with reaction and how it might differ in the Middle East as compared to here.
So in Iran, like everywhere else, it's a very multifaceted society. There are people who are publicly mourning and grieving. There are people who are very, very heartbroken. There are also people who are celebrating. There have been reports from various cities in Iran of fireworks. There have been certainly dozens or even hundreds of social media posts of Iranians celebrating. Hossein Amir Abdullahian was also one of the government figures responsible for the crackdown against Women Life Freedom. So he was also not a very popular figure among the opposition. So there are people with mixed reactions in Iran. Outside of Iran, I have seen reports in Syria, in Idlib particularly, of Syrians celebrating because, as you may know, Iran under the Islamic Republic and Bashar al-Assad are allies, and Assad is responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of Syrians and the displacement of more than 50% of the Syrian population, internally or externally. So people in Syria, many of them who are opposed to the Assad regime, are also celebrating that an ally that enabled that kind of brutality against them is now dead. That said, of course, they know that the government of Iran hasn't changed, but still it is considered a sort of auspicious occasion for a lot of folks. There are also those in Syria and other countries in the region who are mourning because Iran has been successful in many sectors of the region at positioning itself as a defender of the downtrodden and the oppressed in its alignment with the Palestinian cause. And so there are those who are very upset because they believe that the death of Raisi and Amir Abdullahian represent a loss for allies of the beleaguered Palestinian people.
Understood. Well, we covered a lot of ground. Sahar Razavi, professor at Sac State, thank you so much for adding some perspective to this world story.
Thank you very much for having me.